Thank you guys for tuning in and welcome to another episode of The Source. I'm your host Zain Raza. In this program, we interview philosophers, researchers, policy experts, or whistleblowers. Today, I'm joined by activist, author, and philosopher, and the co-founder of the Democracy in Europe movement, Srećko Horvat. Srećko, thank you so much for joining us again.
Thank you so much for having me again.
Let us begin with Assange. We've been in a few weeks in quarantine, but Julian Assange has been isolated for 3,396 days. And if we look at his conditions closely and compare it to ours, when we see his conditions in the embassy, he received no sunlight, was not able to go to walks, let alone shopping. His internet eventually was cut off, and he was also spied when he met with his doctors or lawyers. In Belmarsh, he has been now had very limited contact with prisoners or his family members and spends most of his time in solitary confinement. What do you think we can learn from Assange's isolation during this corona quarantine period?
It's a very good question, and I think we can learn actually really a lot. First of all, because this whole concept of self-isolation today, I think is already a very ideological concept. Like in the sense, of course, you and me can self-isolate because we are lucky enough to have a home. But what about all those homeless people? Or to put it into the context of Julian Assange, who is at this moment at high security prison Belmarsh in UK, how can the prisoners, the inmates, be protected from coronavirus? So our situation, to be honest, I get annoyed when I hear from white Europeans, YOLOs or hipsters who complain, oh, I'm already for 1 week in self-isolation and I'm eating pasta every day. This is a luxury compared to the situation of the majority of people, especially when coronavirus will hit into Latin America, India. Now it's starting already. You've seen India is under total lockdown. So at this moment, already around 2 billion people in the world are in lockdown. At the same moment, according to the data, more than 11 million prisoners are in prison at this moment. And you have seen what happened in Italy. What happened in Italy is that 13 people died. What you can see on Rikers Island in the US, you can also see that there's also, first of all, they found this 16 or 17 officers were infected, and then there was a kind of conflict between them. And this makes the situation of Julian even harder, and it makes it even more relevant to get him out on bail. But we can talk about that later. You asked about self-isolation. He was, as you said, thousands of days in isolation. It wasn't self-isolation, it was isolation. He was forced to take refuge and political asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. He didn't go there because he liked it there, and no one goes to London because of the nice weather, as we know. And he couldn't even see the weather. I've been several times to the embassy and spent some time with him there. And, this situation, you're constantly under artificial light. There is no air inside. All the governments, imagine that they are on your shoulders, and they were not just here on the shoulders, they were inside of the room, as it was revealed. CIA directly or indirectly spying, not only on Julian Assange, but also on his lawyers, on everyone who came in. So the situation of his was already precarious. Since 2002, he has a chronic lung condition. He has, obviously, because he hasn't seen he didn't see the sun for now 8 years. So he obviously also has a lack of vitamin D. And if there is anything good in the coronavirus crisis, I think it is that those people who were privileged enough not to feel the burden of social distancing, isolation, self-isolation, and so on, might finally understand how it was for this courageous publisher to be in isolation for so many days and to be now in solitary confinement in a high security prison where even the social visits are now completely cancelled, and there is a big fear that coronavirus might spread in Belmarsh prison.
Let us talk about the opportunities and also the dangers in such a crisis. Let us focus on the opportunities part first. For many people who are at home, they have now time to delve into topics such as press freedoms and privacy and stuff like that. So talk about the importance of whistleblowers such as Wikileaks and what people can do to support press freedom and Julian Assange.
Well, first, to really deep into the WikiLeaks files, you need time, of course. And usually it was the journalists who were doing it, professionally. But now I think the coronavirus crisis with around 2 billion people, I mean, can you imagine the number? 2 billion people in the world confined in one way or the other to quarantine or self-isolation. I think this is a brilliant chance to dive into the WikiLeaks cables. I did it recently just to check out about viruses. And it's amazing, actually, what you can find there. So you can find that as of 2009, the United States are requesting import of the genomes of viruses such as Ebola or Marburg, 2009. Then you can also find some revelations or interesting documents published on WikiLeaks on the swine flu. For instance, on the Ebola outbreak in Liberia, 2013, you can also find, which is also very interesting, precisely in this moment when the vaccine is, trying to be found and so on. You can find that, I don't know which year it was, but that the Polish government made tests on homeless people. So they basically infected homeless people with the avian flu, with the bird flu, to test a vaccine. Vaccine and even one pregnant woman. If you go to WikiLeaks, you can find it there. So basically what you can see, if you look at the existing documents of WikiLeaks, is that there is a dirty history connected to viruses. So in this sense, it's also an even bigger shame and tragedy that Julian Assange is held in that bloody, dark, solitary confinement at Belmarsh prison, because I think we would really, as humanity, benefit from revelations on the coronavirus. There have been some whistleblowers in China and so on, but imagine if those whistleblowers, not only from China, but from everywhere, would send this information. They can even send it now to WikiLeaks. I mean, I don't have anything to do with WikiLeaks, so I'm not inviting, don't send it to me. I don't have anything to do with it. I would just love to read it, because I think it shows that there is a history. As of 2009, the US is obviously doing something with viruses, importing the genomes and so on. There are laboratories around the world, and I think WikiLeaks is a precious library to read about it. But this is only one aspect of the importance of WikiLeaks, but which shows how relevant it is today. But for instance, also from the perspective of the coronavirus crisis, what is happening with the sanctions, with Iran at this moment, what is happening with Venezuela, all these things were in a way already implicated by the revelations of WikiLeaks, because again, it proves the imperialism and exceptionalism of the United States, which in a moment of a deep crisis of the whole planet, pushes for sanctions for a country where people basically die. On the other hand, you have beautiful examples like the Cuban doctors showing solidarity, helping in Italy and so on. But then you can see in which way Cuba is treated geopolitically. And I think that was one of the big, a very big achievement of WikiLeaks to shed a light on the global geopolitical scene, to shed a light on the dirty deals between governments, from corruption to war crimes. But unfortunately, we are in a situation that the person who revealed the war crimes is in high security prison under threat of spreading coronavirus in the prison, while those who committed the war crimes are not only free, they are not even persecuted.
Let me mention that you visited Julian Assange personally when he was in the embassy. DiEM25, as we know, is in touch with Julian Assange. He calls your co-founder, Yanis Varoufakis. So I want to talk about his mental state. You've seen his mental state. What do you think people can learn from his mental state that are undergoing the same sort of psychological traumas in this isolation state?
Yeah. Let me just say first that Julian was one of the first members of DiEM25. Although he didn't always agree with us, we didn't always agree with him, mainly on the issue of Brexit. But even at that time, I was visiting him and the embassy, and we had discussions about it. You don't always have to agree with someone in order to see that a big injustice is happening, and especially in political terms like Brexit or something like that. I think Brexit is now, it's a distant past compared to the utter dystopia of today. So. The last time I visited Julian was the first time and the last time at Belmarsh prison was, I think, in November uh, last year. And to be honest, I was expecting much worse in the sense that I was expecting someone who would be broken, someone whose intellectual capacities would also be to a certain degree broken. But in that 1 hour that I was there, together with John Shipton, his father, uh, Julian was just amazing. I mean, you could have seen that it was hard for him, of course, but he wasn't thinking about himself. We spoke a lot about his case, a lot, only 1 hour about his case, but he also had thoughts on the situation outside of prison. As far as he can hear, because he cannot meet anyone, especially now. Now he cannot even have visits. But even in this situation, he called Yanis Varoufakis and basically commented on the current situation, and that makes me really sad because I think his voice in this situation would really be precious. To have his voice, to have his comment and his understanding, because his understanding of the global situation was always a sort of zooming out of the globe, zooming out and then looking at the globe and the planet as an interconnected network of interconnected power interests and also on the other side interconnected struggles. He was always able to go from the concrete to the universal, and he always had a big picture in mind. And I think especially today this big picture is missing. In a situation during this crisis when all the countries are looking inwards, we are in our homes also inwards and so on. We also need this big picture, and I think that was that's what Julian, I think, still kept. But at the same time, I can imagine that it is very hard for him to, imagine someone who is 23 hours in his cell and then collects all his thoughts, all his emotions to make a single phone call of 10 minutes. And now not even see anyone, now being denied or to get out on bail. Also, this kind of uncertainty. Look at the uncertainty we have, which again I think is a privilege for me. Also for many of those who will watch us, because we are at home. We have I cannot return to my country. Borders are closed. I don't know when I will see my family and so on, and it's rather bad. I feel depressed about it very often because there is an uncertainty, because you don't know when it will end and whether it will end and when we will be able to return or live normally, although I think there is no return to normal. But now imagine his uncertainty. After 7 years of isolation, what the UN called arbitrary detention, now being in prison already for almost 1 year, I think, now not even seeing anyone, which means basically 24 hours in his cell, and the next extradition court hearing was supposed to happen end of May, beginning of June. What will happen? How will those witnesses, spies from the United States travel to United Kingdom? Even now at this court hearing where his lawyers requested bail, you could have already seen people in masks. Not many journalists, unlike the previous one, there were only 5 journalists or something like that. This is also a big problem because now all the media attention shifts to the coronavirus, which is also not necessarily bad. I think, there is also an opportunity in that. But I think the uncertainty is really killing. Uncertainty in the sense that, what you were looking towards, now you don't even know whether it will happen. and you are constrained in a place which is like, you imagine, you remember those cruiser, Princess Diamond and so on, and you imagine 3,000 people on a cruise ship, and the virus is spreading around. I mean, that already looks like a dystopia, but they were in a room, the food was delivered and so on, and then it was found that the food which was delivered was infected, by the crew on the ship. Now, to make a parallel, imagine that boat, which is a luxurious virus prison, with a real prison where also the officers who carry food and so on might infect and so on, and where he is in a room without television, without internet, without anything. We even have internet at home, we can communicate. So I think this situation at this moment is really dire and is urgent, more urgent than ever, to get him out of prison.
Srećko, let us take a small pause here of the conversation. We're going to a short break and we're going to return in a second, so check out this commercial.
Pure journalism. Every journalist in the world should have been cheering Edward Snowden. He did what every journalist is supposed to be devoted to.
Because we have evidence that when we do that, things go wrong.
Welcome back. We're talking to philosopher, author, and activist Srećko Horvat. We touched upon Julian Assange's case, and now we're going to talk about the coronavirus. Srećko, thanks for your time. Let's start with the coronavirus. No one saw this coming. It feels like a financial crisis or wartime. Asian governments reacted very fast, and we saw a big clampdown in China and in South Korea and in Singapore, whereas there was a very late reaction in Western governments. And there was this quick escalation in a short period of time, which led to a media frenzy, panic buying, confusion, and now we're seeing the economic disasters compiling onto each other. How do you assess the reactions of the Western governments?
Well, you're completely right that there is a big chaos at the moment, and panic and so on. Panic of the people, panic of families, panic of the markets. Not so much panic among some populist leaders who were laughing at the coronavirus, but they knew about it. If you look, recently it was published that the U.S. Secret Services were warning Donald Trump already in January that something very intense, unlike a normal coronavirus, is happening in China, and that they are not sure whether China will succeed to contain it, and they even imply that China is minimizing the threat. So Donald Trump had on his table already that document in mid-January. Imagine how many deaths could have been avoided if he reacted. And the same goes, for China as well. There are even some medical scientific studies from November 2019 which are already mentioning the coronavirus and the possibilities of an outbreak. So it's not that people didn't know about it. It's not the scientists didn't warn about it. There are even system models of how a global pandemic would affect the whole world, although coronavirus wasn't mentioned there. But even the coronavirus has been mentioned for the last months. So when you see this reaction of Donald Trump now or Boris Johnson, they are too late with their reactions, and many of the reactions are actually even more worrying than the coronavirus itself.
The same reaction we saw in the German government. In February, there was the Robert Koch Institute was saying that there's very little danger. Our health minister was saying that there is nothing to fear about, and all of a sudden we saw this huge escalation. But I want to focus on the things that we could have controlled as a society, and this pertains to healthcare and also the policies that we are implementing in terms of austerity or increasing our military budgets, and what effects it has on our healthcare system and the way we co-op with this crisis, the way we handle this crisis. Could you talk, because DiEM25 is doing a lot about advocating an alternative to the austerity policies. It does a lot about anti-war and against militarism. Could you talk about the role that our society, our governments, and our politics plays in creating the conditions for this virus to flourish?
I belong to those who don't believe that there is such a thing as a natural catastrophe. Even when a hurricane happened, or when Haiti happened, or New Orleans, and so many other disasters, or the Australian bushfires, droughts, floods, and so on, these are not really just natural catastrophes. And in the same way, although now we have this little, it's not even a DNA, it's an RNA, a little organism which is now making this big havoc and this big chaos in the world. Although it's a biological thing, it's also the catastrophe which is happening is not natural. Because what you could have seen in many countries, and what we will see, and it will get even worse probably, is that when you have such a virus, which still didn't mutate, and it's still not so deadly as, for instance, Ebola or the plague or something like that, although it's very, the contagion is very high, and we should protect ourselves and protect the others. I'm not saying that, on the opposite. But what we could have seen is that this tiny organism has succeeded to lead to so much tragedy and sorrow, dead family members, collapse of healthcare systems, collapse of public infrastructure, basically everything, the whole economic and social life in many countries is completely stopped. From theaters, cinema, to restaurants, but also any other activity. And what it shows, is that unless there is a system which is prepared for such a global pandemic, we will be in this situation in which we are today. And if you have decades of austerity, if you have decades of the erosion of the public services, of course you will be in a situation like today. And add to that irresponsible governments, populists, people who don't care whether anyone will die, they just care to keep office, and you really have a deadly combination which goes beyond the mere small organism of COVID-19 or coronavirus, and in that sense, I think it's not a natural catastrophe. It's a catastrophe of neoliberalism, or it's a catastrophe of the legacy of Chicago boys, of decades and decades of this kind of philosophy. There is no society, Margaret Thatcher. There are only individuals, and the society. What we will do with the society, we will deregulate slowly and, take a part of the society, the hospitals, take the universities, take the streets, take the cities. We will name them smart cities. You will get private healthcare. You will get a loan if you want to study, so you can be happy and so on. But this kind of society, this Chicago boy, Ayn Rand, Margaret Thatcher wet dream of a future society is obviously not ready to deal even with a small, tiny virus. You could have seen it in the supermarkets in the West. How often they show you the images of empty supermarkets in Venezuela or Cuba. Well, did you see the images from Germany, Italy, United States, Canada, Australia? Empty supermarkets, no toilet paper. What kind of system this is, which cannot even secure toilet paper? You can see it on all levels that this ideology and reality of neoliberalism is now completely imploding, and that it is not ready to deal with older people. It doesn't even want to deal with older people. This system would be happy if all the elder people just die, because they don't have to pay the pensions then. And it doesn't deal, if you go to the streets and see who is on the streets now in quarantine cities, well, you will see it's shop assistants, waste collectors, postmen, delivery people, and so on. And besides them, who is the one who is, as they now call it in this kind of war discourse, on the front line? It's the doctors and medical sisters and healthcare workers. And you suddenly, I think, that might be the good outcome of the coronavirus crisis. Even those people, who were stupid enough not to care about anything else about their own ass, will now realize that they have to care about those layers of society and the working class, if you want, and the healthcare system, if their own ass wants to survive, because what coronavirus shows is that you have to protect others if you want to protect yourself. and if you protect yourself, you are protecting the others. So this is completely the opposite of the Margaret Thatcher ideology. You can see that maybe now a new society is being born. Of course, on the other side, you have already a new attack on this new being born society, with again the same kind of ideology, new loans, structural adjustments. We will give you a loan, but you have to do that or that, and so on. So everything is possible.
Srećko Horvat, let us pick up and dig deeper on this conversation on coronavirus. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, and see you soon.
Srećko and I will continue the conversation in the next part. Thank you for joining us today. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and to donate so we can continue to produce independent and non-profit news and analysis. I'm your host, Zain Raza. See you guys next time.